You think you can afford to retire, and the numbers back that up, yet somewhere deep down, your gut keeps whispering to you, no, you can't. You probably run the math more than once, and every time you get close to actually walking away from that paycheck, something reaches out and pulls you right back. And if that sounds like you, I want you to know that you're not being silly, and you're certainly not bad with money, and you're honestly very far away from the only person who feels this way. What you're feeling is so common that researchers actually have a name for it. They call it the retirement savings puzzle. Because for years, experts assumed people would happily spend down what they saved once they stopped working. And the real data came in and showed the exact opposite, that most people barely touched their savings. And nobody really could explain why. It tends to happen to the people who did everything right, the ones who saved diligently for 30, 40 years, and who, by any honest measure, have more than enough. And yet they would still get to the edge of retirement and freeze. They treat their life savings like a museum piece, something to be looked at but never touched. So I want to talk through why that happens, because once you understand what's really going on underneath everything, you can start to address it. And I promise you, this is something that can be fixed. So let me start by proving to you that this isn't just in your head. There's a well-respected research group called the Employee Benefit Research Institution, and they studied how real retirees actually spend their savings over time. Not what people said they planned to spend, but what they genuinely did year after year using decades of real data. What they found is that people who had saved at least $500,000 for retirement spent down only about 12% of it over the entire first 2 decades of their retirement. That means they had 20 full years to enjoy their money. And almost all of it was sitting right there when the study looked back at them again. And it wasn't only the wealthiest households either, because the people who retired with somewhere between a couple $100,000 and $500,000 spent down only about a quarter of their savings across those same 20 years. And then there's the finding that really just, quite frankly, stops me in my tracks, which is that roughly a third of the retirees they studied actually had more money later in retirement than the day that they actually retired. So they didn't just avoid spending their nest egg, it actually grew, and they weren't spending it. The money they could have used to fund memories and experiences remained a number on a statement. That's heartbreaking. But think about what this is really telling us, because if people who clearly have plenty of money are barely touching it, then this was never really about money in the first place. The bank account isn't the problem here. Fear is. And fear doesn't discriminate based on the size of your wallet. So why does this fear get such a tight grip on so many smart, capable, and hardworking people? Well, let me walk you through it piece by piece. And my guess is that most of these are going to feel pretty similar once I say them out loud. The first reason is the biggest one, and it's the one almost nobody warns you about ahead of time. Your entire life, the message was always save, spend a little less than you made, delay the reward until later, and then every raise, every bonus, every smart decision gets funneled toward the future. And you got genuinely good at doing that over the years, until savings stopped being a task that you had to think about, and it quietly became part of your actual identity. Then one day, retirement arrived, and everything you've lived by has flipped completely upside down, because now you're being asked to do the exact opposite of what you've been trained to do. There's a word for this in my world, and it's called decumulation, which is really just a fancy way of describing the season of life where you spend your savings instead of adding to them. But here's the part nobody really tells you about, which is that you spent 40 years training that one muscle, and now you're being asked to use the opposite one, basically immediately, with no warm-up at all. So of course it feels wrong. Breaking ingrained habits is extremely hard. The second reason is the paycheck itself. For decades, money simply has shown up. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, that deposit has landed in your account, and you've never really had to think about it. And you build your whole life on the quiet certainty that more was always on the way. In retirement, that steady deposit stops. And for a lot of people, when it disappears, it feels like stepping off a ledge into thin air. Even though the money is right there in front of you, your brain doesn't trust it the same way, because one of them felt like a river that kept flowing toward you, while the other one feels like a lake that you're slowly draining. And now you're watching the water level drop with every single cup that you take out. They both hold plenty of water, but they feel like completely different things. And that feeling is a big part of what's going on underneath all of this. The third reason is all of the things that you simply have no way of knowing. You don't know how long you're going to live, or whether the market might tumble right after you retire, or what happens if your health slips and you need care that costs a small fortune. These are real and serious questions. And what makes them feel so heavy is that you can't put an exact number on any of them, because you can budget for a car payment, but you can't really budget for a life that you haven't lived yet. So let me give you a little perspective on the living longer piece, though, because I actually think it helps more than it scares. A 65-year-old today can expect, on average, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 21 more years of life. And about 1 in 4 people who reach 65 will end up living past 90. And if you're married, the odds that at least one of you sees 90 are better than a coin flip. I know that might sound like it makes the fear worse rather than better, since it's more years that you have to pay for, but stay with me, because understanding this is actually the first real step towards planning for it. Because you can absolutely plan for 30 years, and 30 years is a real solvable number, which we'll come back to here in a bit. The fourth reason might be the most fixable one of them all, and it's simply that most people don't have a plan. They have money. Your portfolio is not a plan. And a number on a screen that drifts up and down with the market every single day certainly isn't one either. It's just a number. So when your whole sense of safety is tied to something that moves the moment the market opens, of course you feel anxious. And honestly, you'd have to be made of stone not to. This is the spot where a famous piece of advice gets kind of quietly twisted into something scarier than it was ever meant to be. You may have heard of the 4% rule, which came from a actual rocket scientist named William Bengen back in 1994. And what he did was he looked at the market history and he asked a fairly simple question, which was, how much could you pull from your savings each year and still be safe, even if you had terrible luck, and basically retired in the single worst moment in modern history? His answer landed right around 4% per year, nudged up a little each year to keep pace with rising prices. But here's what almost everyone misses, which is that the 4% was the worst case answer, the amount that would have survived the ugliest stretch the market has ever thrown at anybody. Basically, the poor soul who happened to retire right before the world fell apart. Bengen himself has said that almost across all of history, retirees could have safely taken quite a bit more than 4%, in a lot of periods closer to 7%. And when he went back and redid the work in recent years, even his worst case number came out a little bit higher than the original 4%. So think about what actually happened here, because a safety net that was built for the worst storm in a century somehow got turned into a speed limit that scares people every single day, even when the sun is out and the sky is clear. And now people end up anchoring into the scariest possible version of that number and then feeling guilty about spending a single dollar past it. So if you've been white-knuckling your savings because some rule of thumb made you feel like one wrong move could end the whole thing, I gently ask you to take a breath, because that rule was built to protect you, not to trap you. Okay, so now that we know why it's so hard to switch from saving to spending, let's talk about how you actually start to loosen the grip of this fear, because you genuinely can. I know you can, because we've helped many, many people go from being truly terrified to actually enjoying their money. And it almost always comes down to a handful of shifts. So let's walk through them together. The first shift is to turn your pile back into a paycheck. A big part of the fear comes from losing that steady deposit. So the whole idea here is to simply give it back by building your own paycheck out of the money you already have. So you start with whatever's already steady, which for most people means Social Security. And if you happen to be one of the lucky people who still has a pension, then that counts too. And you add those up and treat that as your floor, because that's income that shows up no matter what the market does and what the news happens to say that particular morning. Then you fill that gap between the floor and what you actually want to spend using your savings. But you do it in a planned and deliberate way rather than just grabbing the account whenever you feel a wave of nerves. You need to set an amount arriving on schedule, landing in your checking account like a paycheck you've decided to pay yourself. Here's why that matters so much, because when money starts showing up on a regular rhythm again, something quietly settles in your gut, and that lake starts to feel a lot more like a river again. That single shift tends to take an enormous bite out of fear because you're not draining the pool anymore. You're simply getting paid. The second shift is to actually go and find your real spending number. Most people are afraid because they're guessing. And they honestly have no idea what they spent across the year. So their brain just quietly fills in the blank with the worst possible answer. And the worst possible answer is always going to be scarier than the truth ever was. So the fix is to actually find out what your life costs over 12 months. And I don't mean a wild guess. I mean an honest look at what really goes out the door, both regular monthly essentials and the once a year expenses that are easy to forget about. Once you've got that real number in hand, you can finally line it up against what you've got and what's coming in from the floor we just talked about. And 9 times out of 10, when people actually sit down and do this, the picture turns out to be a whole lot better than the scary storm that they've been carrying around in their head for years. You really can't beat a fear you refuse to look at straight on. And the number living in your head is almost always meaner than the number that shows up on paper. The third shift is to give your money different responsibilities. One of the scariest things in early retirement is watching the market drop and thinking, oh, there goes my grocery money. And that thought alone will keep you up at night. But it really doesn't have to be that way. A cleaner way to think of some of your money is some of it is being for the now, and the rest of it is for later. So the money you're going to need over the next few years can sit somewhere safe and steady where bad markets simply can't reach it, while the money you won't touch for a decade or more can stay invested and keep growing the way it's meant to. The reason this helps so much is that even when the market has a rough year, and absolutely it will have rough years, you're not sitting there panicking because you already know your next few years are covered by the safe money. So the market can do whatever it's going to do while you go on living your life. You've essentially given the storm somewhere to blow that doesn't land on your kitchen table. Now, let me be straight with you about the fear that's often hiding underneath all the other fears, which is long-term care and the nursing home, because that's the one that keeps a lot of good savers completely frozen, and I'm not going to wave it away since it's a real risk. But notice what that fear tends to do, because fear takes one possible expense that's sitting way out in the future, might not even ever happen, and it uses that one maybe to hold your entire retirement hostage. And that really isn't a plan. That's just worry wearing a different and nicer suit. The honest answer is that this is a specific risk that has specific solutions. You can set aside a portion of your savings earmarked just for that possibility. And there are insurance options built exactly for that you can weigh and see whether they fit into your situation. The whole point is that you name the risk out loud, and then you plan for it on purpose, and then you let the rest of your money go and do its job. Because what you don't want to do is let a single what if quietly freeze everything else you spent a lifetime building. The fourth shift is to let go of the idea that one decision locks you in forever. So much of this fear tends to sound like, what if I spend too much and by the time I finally realize it, it's already too late to fix it? But a good retirement plan was never meant to be a single choice you make on day one and then you just cross your fingers and hope. It's a living thing that you check on and adjust and move through. If the market hands you a great few years, then maybe spend a little more and you take that trip you kept putting off or you help the grandkids out. And if you hit a rough patch, then maybe trim back a little for a while and wait for calmer water before the big splurge. These are gentle course corrections rather than anything close to a disaster. And here's the thing about running low that fear never bothers to mention, which is that it almost never happens overnight. You don't go to bed perfectly fine and then wake up broke the next morning. You get years of warning signs along the way and plenty of time to make small adjustments long before anything really gets serious. You are the pilot here, and you're allowed to make corrections for the entire length of the flight. Knowing that you can adjust as you go takes a lot of the pressure off than just trying to get it perfect on the first try. The truth is, nobody gets it perfect on the first try. And that was never really the goal anyway. The goal is having a plan that is flexible enough to bend a little without ever breaking. And that brings me to my last piece, which is less about spreadsheets and a lot more about your heart. Because at some point, you have to actually give yourself permission. I really want to kind of gently remind you of something that you probably already know, but potentially may have lost track of somewhere along the way, which is that the goal was never to have the biggest possible number sitting in your account on the day that you die. You saved all of this money for a reason. And the reason was freedom and time with the people that you love and mornings with no alarm clock and the trips that you always told yourself you're going to take someday. And the chance that you can be there for your family while you're still healthy enough to enjoy every little bit of it. Someday was the whole thing you were saving toward. And at some point, very quietly and without any real announcement, someday has become right now. Think back for a second to that research from the very beginning. All of those people sitting on money that they worked their entire life to build and barely touching a dime of it. Some of them are dying with more than they ever had before. And I didn't bring that up to frighten you. I brought it up because I really don't want that to be the story you look back on one day and quietly wish that you had written a little differently. Money that never gets used didn't actually keep you safe. It just quietly waited around when the entire point of building it in the first place was so that one day it could turn around and take care of you. So here's what I'd tell you if you were sitting across the table with me right now, which is that every single thing we just talked through, the paychecks and assigning marching orders to your money and knowing your real number and planning for the big risks on purpose and giving yourself room to adjust, all of it works so much better when the pieces actually fit together in one clear plan that's built around your real life instead of a rule of thumb or a guess. Because the fear doesn't disappear just because somebody tells you that you're fine. It disappears when you can finally see it, when your money has a job and the income shows up on schedule. And you already know exactly what happens if the market drops in your very first year because you've got an answer ready and waiting. And that's the moment that fear finally runs out of places to hide. And there's one big piece of all of this that we've barely touched yet, and it happens to be the one that quietly makes so many retirees nervous without them really ever realizing it. And that's taxes. Because which accounts you pull money from and the order you do it can shift your entire picture by a whole lot more than most people ever imagine. And if you get it right, you get to keep a lot more of what you built. Well, if you get it wrong, you can end up handing away money you never had to lose in the first place. So if you're interested in learning more about that, this is the next video you're going to want to watch, where I go through the optimal order to withdraw from your retirement assets to maximize your tax efficiency. And if you'd ever like a hand applying any of this to your own situation, you'll find a link right below in the description. Whenever you're ready, just remember, the difference between worrying about retirement and enjoying it usually isn't more money. It's about taking the time to inspect what you already have and building a plan around it. As always, I appreciate you spending part of your day with me, and I'll see you in the next video.